We had a terrific roundtable that was looking at the future of the National Nuclear Weapons Labs. And the idea here was to look at 10, 20, 30 years and think about what really could be done with all the resources and the brainpower in these labs. And what really came about very quickly was a sense that we need a new national consensus and a real kind of new big challenge to kind of cluster all the energy around, redirect the labs, and really energize the whole system.
If we were able to design 3 stellar and intellectually talented national laboratories that were addressing national security concerns, what would we have them work on? The trend is upward for nuclear weapons activities and downward for nonproliferation.
It struck me that on the cover page for this dialogue, it was phrased as the nuclear industrial complex. And I know it's being riffed on there, but it really is an industrial age construct. It's too large. It was scaled to the Cold War. I don't think anybody questions that. And it's extremely, extremely inefficient.
Changing big organizations of any sort, public or private, is extremely difficult.
We're not the first, and hopefully we may be the last, because we'll succeed, to ask the question of how should these labs be oriented and how should these resources be allocated.
One of the big ideas to emerge was to what extent can we use climate change, the next big existential threat alongside nuclear weapons? Could we actually reorient the labs in that new direction?
I think it is a reasonable task to think about the question of climate change as a kind of civilizational crisis, in the same way that the Cold War represented, I think, a kind of civilizational crisis, the potential for ultimate destruction.
The risks and threats from climate change and nuclear weapons is the only two in the same echelon.
I think the single biggest technical challenge our civilization faces is clean energy. How are we going to power this civilization for the next 1,000 years when the oil actually does begin to diminish, when we diminish hydrocarbons for reasons of climate change? We're going to need better nuclear. We're going to need better renewables. We're going to need things like fusion and so on. So these labs are well suited to that purpose.
If we could get the political consensus and say, this is the agenda with respect to energy production, energy efficiency, the nuke piece, whether it's energy or the weapons piece and the nonproliferation piece, that appears to be the only thing I could tag as next grand challenge that is of the scale that we in the Cold War era faced as sort of an existential threat.
If you're going to ask what the future of U.S. national laboratories should be, you should involve the scientists themselves. You should not ask that question primarily of the national security bureaucracy, because the scientists will be able to tell you that it is unscientific to expect that you can solve environmental sustainability from a nationalist perspective. It is impossible to solve political extremism or food safety or human health problems or economic problems from a nationalistic perspective. These require an international effort.
We can't keep elevating the bulk of humanity to prosperity and just use the resources of the planet, and we have to do it in new and original ways. A program we could uniquely do at a national lab, the revival of the nuclear thermal rocket, which the United States developed in the 60s and 70s and again in the 90s. So it's an existing, though needs to be updated technology. The reason to talk about this is that's the fundamental thing you need in order to explore the solar system. Expanding the prosperity of the planet is going to demand the use of resources beyond our atmosphere in the long run. But it also engages the human spirit. But also things like reversing the acidity of the ocean, which you can do. That's just an example of a kind of thing the national labs could work on, and uniquely so, and it links immediately to business. This is exactly what, say, Elon Musk would like to see in the future on the scale of a decade or two. I know because I asked him about it.
Alongside all these big ideas, there were notes of caution that we still live in a very dangerous world, and in fact, the expertise needed to develop and maintain nuclear weapons is going to be with us for a while to come.
I wish I could feel differently, but the world as it is now is a dangerous place and doesn't look like it's going to get any less dangerous in the near future. So challenges like terrorism, small-scale wars, let alone large strategic challenges, those are all things that I think will remain part of the national agenda and part of our national challenge for the coming future.
Are we moving back into a renewed Cold War? Maybe even a hot war? I think the events with Russia recently raise serious questions. It isn't clear that the assumption that lies behind the desire to change weapons labs for some other purpose and so on will persist. We may find ourselves in a new competition, to which you can add, of course, all the smaller powers, the Irans, North Korea, etc.
With that in mind, it seems to me that the laboratories do have a role to play for the country.
But as I go about my day as a citizen, I don't worry about being attacked by a nuclear weapon. I think about other challenges and other security concerns that are not only our nation faces, but we face as the international community. Nuclear weapons don't keep me safe from the consequences of climate change. They don't keep me safe from depletion of other natural resources. They don't keep me safe from ISIS, Islamic State, or an outbreak of Ebola, or a financial crisis. We have to think about where we're putting our national defense dollars as a nation compared to the threats that we face.
But the fact is, one of the reasons these laboratories are expensive is because they do a kind of work that we cannot do in academia, namely working on sensitive technologies, by which I mean basically classified technologies.
The idea of this series here is to not just think big and bold, but also to get concrete and practical. And to that end, we actually had a lot of interesting ideas that could get funded, whether it's by public resources or outside resources, such as the coalition of foundations that are back in the series.
Indeed, a diverse menu and an opening out of the labs is a crucial way to think about them.
A portfolio of things that these laboratories could work on: sustainability, continued nuclear security, clean air, clean water, information infrastructure, and public health.
Ray Bradbury once said to me that NASA thinks it built the space program, but the actual guys who laid the foundations were the science fiction writers. It's a plausible argument because people recognize, say, threats like asteroid threats. There have been 2 big giant rock hits Earth movies. That's a threat everybody recognizes. That's a threat you can say you're going to deal with. I think going to known threats, fears, and opportunities is the smart way to get support.
In terms of one small-scale recommendation or a possible small-scale innovation would be create at one of the existing national laboratories a global security center. That center does all unclassified work. It can network with the national laboratories or academies of sciences of our partner nations around the world, and it can invite people from all over the world to work on common global security problems.
We also had really concrete thoughts about what can be done with the reality as it stands now. And so there was talk of a middle approach, a balancing approach that actually swings big and inspires, but also grinds out reform.
You can't get forces in Washington to move away from what is essentially benign neglect related to nuclear industrial complex. Until we hit the tipping point, if you will, in terms of the politics surrounding that, I think it is going to be an incremental and very pragmatic approach.
I think maybe we need a strategy that's somewhere in between audacious and beltway. I think it's a blend of people like Peter and Gregory aiming for the stars, literally, and then people like Libby and Jim saying, and here's what we need to do to sort of unshackle some of that inertia.
A good strategy is a matter of balance.
Ultimately, the long-term solution is the need to inspire the next generation of innovators coming up, but also inspire the public to actually move on to the nation's next big challenges, and not just this nation's, but those of the world.
If you're a young postdoc, and you want to go somewhere, you're not thinking Los Alamos or Livermore like you might have been in the 60s and 70s. You're thinking Google or Facebook or Twitter.
When I look at a lot of young people today, I'm involved in social ventures and venture capital and so on. And what I see is a lot of people hungry to solve problems by innovation, invention, doing stuff like you're doing, Pete. This is an example. This is a non-governmental effort to solve the problem of democratic participation.
This has become a democratic issue. For decades, the labs were not democratic. But now we're in a different world where we, as a public, are aware of the extent of the national nuclear weapons complex. We all get a vote here. We literally get a vote. We get a vote of who we elect to Congress to make these kinds of decisions.
Everybody knows the problems are large, and to find a way to say your government is on this. Your government is going to work with the wealth of the American technological community, including the private, is a really important message, and it will help you sell it with Congress. So throughout my talk here, I've given specific examples of things like geoengineering and nuclear thermal rockets, because I think putting something on concrete on the table focuses interest. You've got to proceed by specific examples to get people interested. They're not excited by policy papers. They're excited by horizons.
Can we find the missions which are inspiring and attract young talent to want to participate, to want to engage, to want to devote their lives to it? What are the challenges that are worth really investing in?